In music, listening is regarded as the most fundamental contact with music performance. We talk about the sound, we prepare our sound, and we're listening for sound. Actually, we're actually watching performers more than we even realise, and watching them is almost as important as listening to them when we think about music performance. Listeners and examiners tend to judge performers from the moment they walk onto the stage. Before they've even played the first note, the examiners have decided what mark they're going to get. There's something about the visual appearance that's given them enough information, so the confidence perhaps as they walk onto the stage, the way in which they assume the position to play their instrument, and the kind of preparation to perform tells the audience and tells those critics as much as they need to know about the performance as the sound itself. So we assume that listening is the most fundamental contact we have with music performers, but actually when they are in front of us, then we are engaging with them in a number of ways to inform our decisions and to inform the information we're getting about the performance. If I can take you to a completely different setting, so when baby is recognising mum or dad, from about 4 months, baby needs both the sound and the vision to work out that it's mum. It's only by 5 months and 7 months that baby can recognise mum by her speaking voice or by her talking face. The way we engage with musicians kind of works in the same way. A project I did a little bit earlier on, maybe 2 years ago, was looking at that influence in watching performers. How important is the visual in telling us about the sound quality that they produce? So I'd play silent movies of performers performing a piece and let people absorb the sound through just the visuals, and then I would play them audio clips to see if they could match the sound quality with the person they had seen. People were surprisingly good at this. They thought they were terrible at it. They were really unconfident, but they could match together because we separated out the two sensations and put them back together. We can tell how much information they're getting by looking rather than listening. Let me tell you about a recent project, the moot audition, so the mock audition, where students were not only auditioners, so auditioning for a panel, but also members of the panel, to teach them a little bit more from enacting the experience, but being the expert listeners, but also having an opportunity to be the expert performer. The expert listening was the thing I was interested in. How do you make people expert in listening when they cannot see a performer, so the performer is behind the screen, or when they can actually engage with the performer because they're in front of the screen. Performers and listeners were, I think, quite shocked at how a screen affects their performance. So they're performing, they suddenly feel away from the audience, they feel no interaction, they don't even know when to start. But when there's just rustling papers behind the screen, there's no interaction with the audience to give you those kind of visual cues or those kind of communicative cues that would tell you when to begin. For the listeners who were judging the performances, suddenly they were much more critical. Certainly when the performers were behind the screen, they focused in on the sound and they were imagining what the person might be doing, how the person might be performing, and what they might be looking like. So when they could suddenly see the performer, it was actually quite confronting. And listeners were suddenly aware, because of this contrived situation, of how much they paid notice to the look of the performer rather than just the sound of the performer. They became aware of different things in the performance, things that they would notice, things that they would tune into, and they were aware that they were being almost confounded by having too much information about the sound from both the sight and the sound. A little bit like The Voice, if you can imagine. I think they cheat on The Voice because the judges, although they can't see the performer, they're looking at the reaction of the audience. So they're getting a lot of information and a lot of feedback about the sound that's behind them. So it's almost as if it was in front of them. They're seeing the reaction of the faces in front of them. In an orchestral edition, there's not that engagement with the audience, so you can't really tell. Nobody can see. Nobody should be able to see the performer in front of them. My interest in the sight and sound of music performers started in an experimental context where I would mimic experiments in the psychological literature, looking at matching the sight of performers with the sound of performers. That's interesting for interesting's sake, but the way I would now like to deal with it is actually to bring it into the curriculum. So we concentrate on sound in performance, so training singers and training instrumentalists to sound fantastic, but I think we also have to train them to look fantastic, or to at least think about the way they're engaging with the audience and the way they look and the way they present themselves on stage. The audience is evaluating them from the moment they walk onto the stage, and they need to be aware of the presentation that they are giving to an audience. I think even the awareness of the research literature on the sight and sound of music performance is enlightening to music students. I ran a course this semester, the perception of music performance, and we trialled a lot of these things in class. We looked at the way in which we walk on stage and the way in which we engage with performers. By sound, the way we describe sound, we're actually not as good at describing what we hear as we think we are, and we often remember what a person looked like rather than what they sounded like. To give students the experience of being in the driving seat where they are the expert listener gives them much more of a sense of how this all pieces together and how it works. Things that they've not considered before suddenly become obvious in watching how somebody walks onto the stage, in watching how somebody engages with the audience, watching how somebody demonstrates their expressivity. By sound and by sight often gives the audience more information than actually the sound itself. I think you learn more about the research literature by experiencing it rather than just reading it. Reading it, it tells you a fact and something that's interesting about music performance, but until you actually experience for yourself in how to make judgments, in how you do make judgments, in a safe environment where you're not being judged about the judgments you're making, but you get to experience what it's like to be an auditioner, what it's like to be an evaluator or an examiner, and think, how am I evaluating these performances? How am I going to give feedback to the person who's performing, and how am I going to discuss it with my colleagues? So you need to think about all of those things in this sort of how you work out to be an expert listener. I think students have always recorded lessons, audio recorded lessons and their performances. I think a lot more nowadays will record their performances. Sometimes they don't want to watch the performance back, which I find really interesting. What is it about watching rather than just listening that is so terrifying? And why is it so important? Certainly from my Perceptions of Music performance class, students will now be recording much more, video recording as well as audio recording, to make sure that they know what's being presented to an audience. And I think that's really important. At the moment, listening is this secret, I call it tacit knowledge. People know how they do it. They do it instinctively. They synthesize all this information about a performer and they make a judgment. They're not always able to articulate what it is that helped them make that judgment. And therein lies the difficulty of musical judgments. Why is one performer better than another? Do we share that? And then why do we share that? How do we feed that back to a performer? I think awareness of that tacit knowledge, experience of that tacit knowledge, seeing and hearing how examiners make those decisions, what influences them, what extra musical factors influence what you're wearing, how you walk, your makeup, your smile, do you engage with the audience? Experiencing how that affects the way our listeners judge will not only help these performers go out to be better performers, but will also tell them a little bit about what influences them when they're making judgments.